Welcome to the Gary Null Show, a program designed to enhance mental, physical, and spiritual well-being through science and the wisdom of the ages. Let us take you on a journey of empowerment. Sit back, relax, and get ready to change your life for good.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to the Gary Null Show. There's a lot that goes into this program. Sometimes it's inviting leading experts to come here in the studio and to share their views with you. Now, unlike many shows where it's just chit-chatting back and forth, no, I don't do that. I believe that this form is best used as a classroom on the air, where experts can share with you uninterrupted. Outside of me introducing and saying goodbye, they're sharing information. I also do an awful lot on health and nutrition, but I also take a look at public health issues, and I do award-winning documentaries. What you're about to see now is the beginning of a several-part series called Fatal Fallout, and this is a program that you really need to know about because this information is not getting out in the mainstream media.
Hello, I'm Martin Sheen. The film you are about to see, Fatal Fallout, produced and directed by Gary Null, traces the entire history of the nuclear weapons and energy industries. We are shown the links between the weapons industry and the nuclear power industry and how our government has attempted to silence the truth about the huge amount of damage already done. A major meltdown or terrorist attack on a nuclear reactor could render hundreds of square miles permanently uninhabitable, in addition to killing tens of thousands of human beings. We must educate ourselves and stand up to the special interests who pollute our environment. It has been shown that when plants are closed down, the cancer rates dramatically decrease. We must start raising our awareness and work to have a better, more healthful planet. It is up to the people who care to make a difference. Future generations are counting on us.
One of the astonishing revelations of the 9/11 Commission was the fact that the terrorists, in seeking out targets in the New York area, first looked at nuclear installations. They didn't clarify precisely which installations, but we know that it's Indian Point. Indian Point is a commercial nuclear reactor north of Manhattan. It is perhaps the most dangerous commercial machine on the planet Earth.
On 9/11/2001, a group of 17 al-Qaeda terrorists chose to crash their planes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing more than 3,000 people. But had they flown 10 miles further north, they could have just as easily crashed their planes into the Indian Point nuclear facility.
Terrorists blew a plane through Indian Point.
Class 9 accident at a nuclear power plant. The dome overpressurizes and cracks. Radiation spews out of the dome. By 2 o'clock, the winds are blowing at 10 to 15 miles an hour. Radiation now is going past the evacuation zone. Heaters and detectors will start to go off scale. At 3 o'clock, large portions of Manhattan are now being doused with radiation. But for the most part, people will carry on their normal affairs, not realizing that they've taken a lethal dose of radiation from the Indian Point nuclear power plant.
Radiation cannot be felt, it cannot be seen, it cannot be smelled.
All you'd notice was a metallic taste in your mouth. You'd all be trapped. Millions and millions and millions of people.
One successful hit.
No one would get out.
21 million people. All the children in schools will be bussed out on school buses. Since there are not enough buses to make just one trip, the plan is that there will be multiple trips of school buses. But the public is not supposed to know.
At 4 o'clock, the governor comes on television to make the announcement that evacuation plans have been made to evacuate people 10 miles from the Indian Point nuclear power plant. Well, sorry about that. Radiation has already soared over Manhattan.
The entire logical structure of the plan is fundamentally flawed and not even honest. They don't plan for a terrorist attack on the Indian Point because they can't.
At 6 o'clock, the President of the United States comes on television to announce that a major terrorist attack has taken place at Indian Point. However, the evacuation plans for New York City are not in place because New York City is outside the evacuation zone. What happens to the people in Manhattan? There's chaos. People don't know which direction the cloud went. There are going to be tens of millions of people fleeing the contaminated areas. Everyone gets into their cars and spontaneously evacuates with or without an emergency evacuation plan. The Long Island Express is the world's largest parking lot. People in the outlying areas are not going to have the social infrastructure. They're not going to have the beds, the foods to handle the millions of people that are going to be flooding out of the New York metropolitan area. And they're going to be covered with radiation. At that point, perhaps farmers may pick up shotguns, just like in the 1950s, to keep the New York City slickers out.
Within 24 to 48 hours, people would be experiencing severe nausea and start vomiting and developing severe diarrhea, and they would die within days or a week or two of acute radiation sickness, like the way AIDS patients die. New York would really be a long-term intensive care unit with people all waiting to die.
America should also expand a clean and unlimited source of energy, nuclear power. Many Americans may not realize that nuclear power already provides 1/5 of this nation's electricity safely and without air pollution.
There are 3 plants in the United States that many people consider are perhaps the 3 most dangerous machines on the surface of the earth. They are Indian Point, which is outside New York City, Zion, outside Chicago, and Limerick, outside Philadelphia. We realize that there is something called the 10-mile evacuation zone. Why did they choose that number 10? Why wasn't it 15 or 20 miles? Because if they had extended it to 15, 20 miles, then you would have had to evacuate Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, which of course is a physical impossibility. It would have been obvious then that the 10-mile evacuation zone was a fraud. I'm a physicist. I don't believe that the winds stop blowing at 10 miles from a nuclear power plant. That would be a new law of physics if all of a sudden we saw the wind suddenly stop blowing 10 miles from a nuclear power plant. In case of an accident, or in case of just routine emissions from Zion, Limerick, and Indian Point, radiation will spread much farther than 10 miles. And so I think here we have a folly of the NRC, that they can mandate a law of physics that radiation travels no more than 10 miles from a nuclear power plant.
New reactor designs are even safer and more economical than the reactors we possess today. We can generate tens of thousands of megawatts of electricity at a reasonable cost without pumping a gram of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere.
Now the industry is trying to foist on the public a new generation of nuclear power plants, the high-temperature gas reactor, perhaps 400 of them, which President George Bush has stated will save us from the greenhouse effect and will prevent us from being overly dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Well, I think this is jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. Because if you look at the so-called next generation of nuclear power plants, the only thing going for them is that a meltdown does not take place in 1 hour. That's all it takes for a Class 9 nuclear meltdown to take place at a commercial nuclear power plant of today. The new generation of nuclear power plants, they say, take 24 hours to melt down. You could have dinner, and you could go out and have dinner with your friends, even in the middle of a meltdown. That's the selling point of this new generation of reactors. However, the problems with this new generation of reactors are obvious. They still melt down. Maybe it takes 24 hours, but they still melt down. And plus, they create the same amount of nuclear waste as before, and they are still sitting ducks for any terrorist. You could take a new generation or old generation nuclear power plant and paint a bullseye around them, because they would be a magnet for any terrorist who wants to disable a major metropolitan area and strike a blow in the name of terrorism.
The weak link in a nuclear power plant is not the dome of the reactor that we see in photographs. It's the spent fuel pond that no one even thinks about. We have a lightly guarded swimming pool containing many cores worth of nuclear materials that is subject to a terrorist attack.
In their cooling pools with the spent fuel, there's 30 times as much radiation as that contained in a reactor core, which is about 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. So you multiply the size of Pennsylvania by 30 because of the cooling pools, and you can contaminate many states of the United States. Terrorists don't need nuclear weapons. They're deployed all over the country.
Many people think that commercial and weapons nuclear energy are two different entities. That's wrong.
There's no law of physics preventing a commercial facility being turned into a weapons facility. That separation is in the minds of bureaucrats.
They have the same nuclear fuel cycle. They have the same processing, the same mining, milling, and enrichment of uranium, and they share the same waste facilities. Even the people who run the plants. We're talking about Exxon Nuclear, for example, that is heavily in, of course, oil as well as nuclear energy. We're talking about the same companies, the same individuals that operate one and operate the other. But some people have said that a commercial nuclear power plant can never be made into a weapons plant, and never the twain shall meet. That's been the mantra for 40 years, until President Clinton finally let the cat out of the bag. President Clinton was faced with a reactor, a Russian reactor, that was going to be sold to the Iranians, a commercial reactor that fulfilled every single obligation of the International Atomic Energy Commission. Well, Bill Clinton, when he was president, invoked the full power of the presidency to say that he opposed the sale of Russian reactors to Iran because everybody knows, he said, that you can make bombs from a commercial nuclear power plant. Well, it took the President of the United States to rip off the fiction that there is a wall between commercial energy and nuclear energy.
The Department of Energy is now intending to take plutonium from Russia and from decommissioned nuclear bombs to Georgia and to reprocess it and purify it specifically for America to make many more hydrogen bombs, even though the Cold War is over. They say they're going to mix the plutonium with uranium for MOX fuel, mixed oxide fuel, and put it in civilian power plants, which is terribly dangerous because if there's a meltdown, you get much more plutonium than you would just the 500 pounds released from an ordinary uranium-powered plant if you mix plutonium in with the uranium fuel. But actually, the hidden agenda is to create more bombs from the plutonium. This is really evil.
Right now, the president is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to research bunker-busting nuclear weapons. The United States is pursuing a new set of nuclear weapons. It doesn't make sense. You talk about mixed messages. We're telling other people, you can't have nuclear weapons, but we're pursuing a new nuclear weapon that we might even contemplate using.
Not only are we not cutting nuclear weapons or making offers to negotiate down and work for nuclear weapons-free world, we are spending $6.5 billion a year on new nuclear weapons research and development. And we're talking about mini nukes that are more usable. We're talking about bunker busters that will be nuclear tipped. This is like insanity because it's a terrible threat to every other country on the planet. So they want to keep up with us. So we're fueling an arms race. And add to that our determination to weaponize space. That's very threatening to China and Russia because that means we have a first strike capacity and they have nothing to hit us back with. So we're going to start an arms race in space too.
George Bush has called for a 2/3 reduction in nuclear arms, even as testing goes into cyberspace. even as testing goes into simulations, as we gear up for third-generation hydrogen warheads. Third-generation hydrogen warheads are designer hydrogen warheads. They're warheads that can go underground and knock out bunker positions. They're warheads that can be used in the jungle, in the desert, in the Arctic, and in outer space. These are designer hydrogen bombs, third-generation bombs, and that's what George Bush really wants, to take the nuclear arms race into outer space and to take the nuclear arms race underground to knock out underground bunker positions with nuclear bombs to be dropped also over cities. During the Gulf War, George Bush Sr. was given a plan to drop an atomic bomb over Baghdad. Music magazine revealed that plan. An electromagnetic pulse would be emitted from a hydrogen bomb detonated over Baghdad. It would wipe out all communication systems and radar in Baghdad, leaving American pilots without any anti-aircraft batteries. Also, the plan to reduce nuclear weapons by 2/3 neglects the fact that these weapons are not going to be dismantled. We're not going to take them apart. We're going to simply stockpile them. They'll be placed in a cabinet so that on a moment's notice, we can rev up the nuclear arms race literally overnight. And so I support the reduction of any nuclear weapon. Even one nuclear bomb dismantled, I support. However, let's not fool ourselves. These plans to reduce the nuclear arsenal will simply shelve these nuclear weapons into a cabinet where they can be taken out on a moment's notice.
At this point, frankly, I don't think we can get rid of North Korea's nuclear weapons. I don't think we can stop Iran from reprocessing, which it's trying to do, so that it gets weapons-grade material, which could also be a peaceful use of nuclear weapons, so you don't know. I mean, they keep saying it's just for peaceful use. But at this point, I don't think we are going to have any influence with any of those countries until we say that we have to get rid of all the nuclear weapons.
There's been an enormous emphasis by the Bush administration to revive the fortunes of commercial nuclear power as well as weapons power, especially in outer space. The Bush administration is pushing Project Prometheus. Project Prometheus is a nuclear rocket. We're not talking about huge reactors that will drive rockets to the moon, rockets to the planet Mars. And of course, we're not talking about hundreds of pounds of enriched uranium, perhaps, being stored in reactors that will be sent into outer space. Now, the Bush administration says in its defense that the reactor won't be turned on until the rocket gets into orbit, and then it will be shot to the moon and shot to Mars. However, we've seen it before. Several decades ago, Cosmos 954, a Soviet satellite, was also turned on in outer space. It lost altitude, and it plunged into Canada. Thank God it did not hit a populated area, or there would have been a catastrophe beyond comprehension. 100 pounds of highly enriched uranium plowed into the Northwest Territories of Canada on Cosmos 954. The reactor broke up on impact, disintegrated, and spewed radiation over a distance of 100 miles. If we were to nuclearize outer space and develop anti-satellite, anti-missile capabilities, who is the most vulnerable to killer satellite technology? We are. We have the most communication satellites. We have the most weather satellites. We're heavily dependent upon communication satellites. One small hydrogen bomb in space would cause enormous havoc to the entire communications, military, and commercial sectors of this country by blinding us. In the middle of a fight, it's like throwing sand in the enemy's eyes, blinding them. We are the most vulnerable if we begin the process of nuclearizing and weaponizing outer space.
The only way to protect Americans is to stop weaponization of space and get rid of all the nuclear weapons. And if we took the lead, we could get every other country to follow us.
The Bush administration's policies have come with a complete refusal to acknowledge that there are any health risks from nuclear reactors from routine emissions into the environment.
The Bush administration I see as the most dangerous administration this country has ever had, in the clear light of global warming and the destruction of the planet. They persist in encouraging the oil companies to write their energy policy, the nuclear companies to write their energy policy. I think Cheney cares only for his friends. He doesn't care for the American people, let alone the children of the world, let alone 30 million other species that cohabit the planet with us.
One of the great ways to deal with greenhouse gases is nuclear power plants. And if we go forward in developing these 1,300 new plants we think we'll need over the next 20 years, some of those probably ought to be nuclear. We get 20% of our electricity today from nuclear power. There's no reason why we can't increase that. It is a safe technology, and it doesn't emit any carbon dioxide at all.
These reactors are run by very large utility companies, among them Exelon, Entergy, Dominion, and so forth. They not just make money, but these companies are heavy contributors to political parties, especially to the Republican Party.
How do we know how dangerous radiation really is? We know this by looking at actual case studies. Back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, people were radiation happy. They got radioactive radium, X-rays for all sorts of ailments. They were exposed to criminally high levels of radiation. Then, of course, large numbers of them came down with cancer. So by looking at the amount of radiation given to women who were pregnant, people that had X-rays to the spinal cord, X-rays to the face to treat acne and other kinds of problems, we can now calculate how dangerous radiation was. However, there's a problem. The Hiroshima data is data on hundreds of thousands of Japanese. That outweighed all the other data. The Hiroshima data seemed to indicate that the effects of radiation were exaggerated, and all the radiation studies were done on the basis of Hiroshima data. Now we know the reason why there was a mismatch. The Hiroshima data itself was miscalibrated. By looking at the neutron levels and gamma ray levels, we now know there was a miscalibration between the neutrons and the gamma rays. Now we know that the two levels of radiation are the same. Radiation is perhaps 2 to 5 times more dangerous than we previously thought when we first began to set radiation regulations on workers and the general public. At Hiroshima, it was basically the healthy Japanese who survived. The ones who were weak, the ones who were already sick, they died even before the doctors could come to analyze the effects of radiation. It was basically the Japanese who were already robust, already healthy with a vibrant immune system. They lived long enough to be recorded by the American doctors at Hiroshima. And so for all these reasons, we now begin to realize that the granddaddy of all radiation studies, the studies done at Hiroshima, were in fact miscalibrated. There's a myth that no one has ever died in a nuclear accident. That's remarkable, because I have the autopsies of many of the Americans who died in catastrophic nuclear accidents in the United States. In the weapons program, for example, at Los Alamos, there were 2 workers that were playing with hemispheres of plutonium, and the hemispheres came too close, and essentially a small atomic bomb went off right in their chest. They were exposed to about 5,000 rads of radiation right after the bombing of Nagasaki in 1945 and 1946. Their bodies were exposed to so much radiation that their bodies almost disintegrated at the Los Alamos Hospital. Pictures of them, autopsy pictures I have, showing that yes, American workers at nuclear plants have died horribly in nuclear accidents, all of which were covered up. In 1961, at the SL-1 reactor in Idaho Falls, Idaho, there was a Navy reactor which exploded when a worker took out the control rod. 3 workers died horribly in that accident. 1 worker had a control rod that went right up his groin, came out his shoulder, and pinned him on the top of the reactor. That's how explosive a steam explosion was that ripped apart the SL-1 reactor back in 1961 in Idaho Falls, Idaho. So Americans have died in nuclear accidents, but this has been classified, hushed up by the media throughout the Cold War.
This was the time of the Cold War, when China appeared to be overrunning Korea, and when the world was afraid that Russia would not only overrun Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Latvia, but all of Europe. And we had dismantled our armies after World War II. And as a result, the only thing that stood between us and the horror of communism, a dictatorship taking over the world, were the nuclear weapons. And since our government, both on every state and government level, is absolutely convinced that nuclear energy is clean and safe and emits hardly anything compared to medical x-rays, every health official, every government official wants to see nuclear energy too cheap to meter to become reality. And that was particularly true 20, 30 years ago. And as an enthusiastic young physicist, I was glad to see the air in Pittsburgh cleaned up. You can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste radioactivity, but you can see the smoke belching out and the snow turning black. So it seemed to us that radiation is by far the best way to go. But I have to admit, it never occurred to me that anybody would allow radioactivity from escaping from a nuclear plant. If the American public had learned that even a bomb dropped on Russia or China would lead to fallout that would circulate the globe and come back here to haunt us, to damage our newborn especially, and to endanger the survival of a healthy society, if the public had been aware of this, then we would have lost the value of the threat of nuclear weapons.
Hope you enjoyed it. I'll share more with you next week.